The Young and the Restless Spoilers. One detail could cause a terrible event. The man standing before them looked exactly like Jack Abbott. His voice seemed a little deeper, but perhaps he had a sore throat. However, Diane's intuition wouldn't let that be. After years of living with Jack, loving him, arguing with him, and rebuilding the fragile trust between them, she had developed a keen awareness of the small details that made him who he was. And Diane told Kyle that it wasn't Jack. Kyle noticed every detail, and although the atmosphere was tense, they didn't reveal a single weakness. Jack had disappeared, rumors were spreading, and the shadow of Victor Newman seemed to loom large. Kyle yelled, "Who are you? Why are you pretending to be Jack?" The man retorted, "It's me, your father." "Why are you saying that?" Patty's face changed slightly. The small pauses in his speech sounded rehearsed. Kyle tried to push the thought away, convincing himself that stress could alter anyone's behavior, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was Diane who finally saw the detail that changed everything. When Jack raised his arm, a tattoo was revealed, and Jack had never had one. It seemed like just a detail to confirm it. A dark mark on the inside of his arm caught Diane's eye. At first, it was just a fleeting glimpse, a shadow beneath the fabric. But when the sleeve moved again, the truth became impossible to ignore. Diane gasped. Jack Abbott didn't have a tattoo. Not now, not ever. She knew it with absolute certainty. The sight of the tattoo was like a spreading crack in the reality they had been standing in just seconds before. For a brief moment, Diane hoped there might be some explanation, something harmless that could erase the sudden terror rising in her chest. But the more she stared at the tattoo, the more certain she became. Kyle was increasingly convinced, "You're not Jack, that tattoo." But the more he looked, the pieces began to fit together in a way that filled him with dread. His father would never hide anything like that. Jack was always careful about his appearance, especially in a city like Genoa City where reputation was everything. A tattoo like that simply didn't belong to Jack Abbott. Kyle slowly stepped closer, his eyes narrowed. The man noticed the change in the room's atmosphere. For the first time since entering the house, his usually calm expression wavered for a split second. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Diane saw it. The small crack in his confidence confirmed what she already knew. Something was wrong. Diane felt a surge of anger well up inside her, piercing through the shock that had paralyzed her moments before. Whoever this man was, he had walked into their house pretending to be Jack Abbott. He had spoken to them, looked them straight in the eye, and tried to impersonate someone else. Just thinking about it sent a shiver down her spine. Kyle's instincts were faster than his thoughts. Without warning, he grabbed the man's arm and pulled his sleeve up, revealing the tattoo in its entirety. The reaction was instantaneous. The man recoiled, trying to pull away, but Kyle tightened his grip. "Take it off," Kyle commanded, his voice low and trembling with anger. Those weren't a request. It was a command. Diane stepped closer, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear anything else. The skin on the man's face suddenly looked strange to her. What had previously looked perfectly normal now seemed a little too smooth, too taut on his cheekbones. It was the kind of detail one might overlook at first glance, but once seen, it couldn't be ignored. It was a mask. Kyle's hand acted without hesitation. Before the man could react, he reached out and touched the edge of the artificial skin along the jawline and pulled it down. For a brief moment, the room seemed to freeze. The mask slowly peeled away, revealing something none of them had expected. The face underneath wasn't Jack Abbott. It was completely different. The man staring at them was a complete stranger, a man whose facial features lacked any of the warmth or authority familiar to the real Jack. Kyle recoiled as if burned. Diane felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. From across the room, Patty froze. The sight of the naked stranger had shattered the fragile self-control she clung to. Her eyes widened in utter terror, her face ashen, as if all strength had suddenly drained from her body. For a moment, she could only stare at the man trembling, as if the truth before her had awakened a fear she had desperately tried to bury. The fog rolling off Lake Michigan was thick, a suffocating icy gray blanket that swallowed the docks of the desolate Kenosha Marina whole. The damp chill seeped through Diane Jenkins Abbott's designer trench coat, settling deep into her bones, but she barely registered the biting cold. Her entire existence had been whittled down to a singular agonizing focus, finding her husband Jack Abbott. Beside her, Kyle Abbott moved with a rigid, predatory grace, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle ticked erratically beneath his cheekbone. Ever since the horrifying realization that Victor Newman had orchestrated Jack's kidnapping, sending him out to sea as a pawn in his ruthless corporate games, Diane and Kyle had been consumed by a desperate, frantic manhunt. The cryptic tip from their private investigator had pointed them to this secluded private slip tracking a mysterious luxury yacht that had been sitting off the grid for days. It was the only tangible lead they had after weeks of dead ends, Victor's smug deflections, and the terrifying silence that had consumed the Abbott family. Diane's mind raced with memories of the newly renovated Abbott mansion, the warmth of the roaring fireplace, and the safety of Jack's arms. The stark contrast between the elegant sanctuary she had built for them and this grim, foreboding dock made her stomach churn with nausea. The yacht, a sleek, imposing vessel, painted a deep charcoal, bobbed gently against the wooden pylons. There were no lights on deck, no signs of life, save for the rhythmic haunting slap of the water against the fiberglass hull. "This is it," Kyle whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. He reached into his dark peacoat, his hand resting on the heavy steel-barreled flashlight he had brought for protection. "Stay behind me, Mom. We don't know who is on board or what state Dad is in." Diane nodded, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Just get me to him, Kyle. I don't care about the danger. I just need Jack." They slipped over the side of the dock, their soft-soled shoes making no sound as they boarded the aft deck. The massive tinted glass doors leading into the main salon were locked tight, but Kyle, driven by his son's frantic devotion and the heavy burden of the Abbott legacy, used a specialized glass-cutting tool he had procured just for this mission. Within seconds, the lock mechanism clicked and the heavy door slid open on well-oiled tracks. The interior of the yacht was enveloped in deep shadows, the air thick with the scent of stale champagne, sea salt, and an underlying sickly sweet floral perfume that made Diane's throat close up. It was a scent she recognized from nightmares past. Patty Diane breathed the name, tasting like ash on her tongue. Patty Williams, the woman whose obsession with Jack had spanned decades, a woman who had repeatedly proven herself to be dangerously unhinged. The recent intelligence that Patty had resurfaced and was somehow involved in Jack's captivity had sent shock waves of pure terror through the Abbott family. They crept down the plush-carpeted companionway, the suffocating silence broken only by the muffled, erratic sound of a woman humming a twisted off-key lullaby. The sound was emanating from the master cabin at the far end of the hall. The heavy teak door was slightly ajar, a sliver of warm amber light spilling out into the dark, swaying corridor. Kyle positioned himself squarely in front of Diane, his body tense as a coiled spring. He pushed the door open with his shoulders stepping into the master suite. Diane followed on his heels, her breath catching violently in her throat at the surreal tableau before them. The cabin was opulent, decorated in rich mahogany and cream leather, but it felt entirely like a gilded cage. Sitting in the center of the room, perched on the edge of a velvet chaise lounge, was Patty Williams. She looked terribly disheveled, her blonde hair falling in chaotic, unbrushed waves around her face, her eyes wide and glassy with a manic, delusional gleam. She was holding a silver hairbrush, gently stroking the empty air as if she were lost in a deep romantic fantasy. And there, sitting in a high-backed leather armchair in the dimmest corner of the room, was a man. He was wearing Jack's signature tailored suit, the fine Italian wool perfectly pressed, but his posture was slumped and lethargic as if he had been heavily drugged. The lighting was poor, casting long, deceiving shadows across his face, but the silver hair, the broad shoulders, the familiar commanding silhouette, it was him. It had to be him. "Well, well, well," Patty sang out her voice, a jarring, childlike trill that echoed off the paneled walls. She didn't seem surprised to see them. In fact, she looked almost delighted, her lips curving into a grotesque smile. "Look who came to visit us, Smilin' Jack. It's your ex-wife. Oh wait, current wife. It's so hard to keep track of the women who don't love you the way I do." "Shut up, Patty," Kyle snarled, stepping forward, his flashlight raised like a weapon, his eyes blazing with protective fury. "Get away from my father, now." "He doesn't want to leave," Patty pouted, her lower lip trembling in a bizarre parody of innocence. "We are having a wonderful time. We are finally together just like we were always meant to be. He's resting right now. The sea air makes him so sleepy. It's my redemption, you see." Diane couldn't listen to another word of the madwoman's delusions. The sight of her husband slumped and unresponsive broke whatever fragile dam of restraint she had left. Ignoring Kyle's sharp hiss of warning, she shoved past her son, her maternal and marital instincts overriding all logic, fear, and caution. "Jack," Diane cried out, her voice cracking with a mixture of profound relief and overwhelming sorrow. She rushed across the plush carpet, falling to her knees beside the heavy leather armchair. She threw her arms around the man's broad chest, burying her face in the crook of his neck, desperate for the solace only he could provide. For a fleeting, desperate second, she expected the familiar, comforting warmth of her husband. She expected the faint, sophisticated scent of his expensive bergamot and sandalwood cologne, the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek. But the moment her body pressed against his, a jarring, sickening wave of dissonance washed over her. He felt wrong. The muscles beneath the fine wool of the suit were rigid, but not with the tension of a kidnapped man. It was a strange synthetic stiffness, an unnatural rigidity. And the smell, there was no trace of Jack's signature cologne. Instead, her nostrils were assaulted by the harsh chemical odor of industrial adhesive mixed with stale, nervous sweat. "Jack, honey, it's me. It's Diane. We're here to take you home," she whispered, her voice trembling violently, as she pulled back slightly to look at his face. The shadows still obscured his features, his chin resting heavily on his chest. Desperate to rouse him, Diane ran her trembling hands down his arms, seeking the familiar warmth of his skin. As her right hand slid down his forearm, her fingers snagged on something beneath the fabric of his sleeve. She paused, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She pressed her fingertips into the expensive wool, tracing the outline of whatever was hidden beneath. It was a lump. A hard, jagged, unnatural mass roughly the size of a golf ball protruding from the flesh of his forearm. Diane's breath hitched, trapping the air in her lungs. Jack didn't have a lump on his arm. She knew every inch of her husband's body, every scar, every contour of his skin. This grotesque, hard protrusion felt like a botched subdermal implant or a severely calcified cyst. A cold, creeping dread began to pool in the pit of her stomach, freezing the blood in her veins. Her mind scrambled, trying to rationalize the impossibility of what she was feeling. Had his captors done something to him? Had Victor Newman ordered some kind of twisted medical procedure? While Diane was paralyzed by the tactile nightmare beneath her fingertips, Kyle had moved closer, keeping himself positioned between the armchair and Patty, who was still humming her deranged off-key tune. Kyle's eyes darted from the unhinged woman to the man slumped in the chair. He wanted to help his mother get his father to his feet, but something about the man's posture, the way he breathed, made the hairs on the back of Kyle's neck stand up in primal warning. As Diane's hand gripped the man's forearm, the sleeve of the bespoke jacket rode up slightly, exposing the pale skin of his wrist. Kyle's gaze dropped to the exposed flesh. He blinked, thinking the dim amber lighting of the cabin was playing tricks on his eyes. He took a half-step closer, squinting into the shadows. There, peeking out from beneath the crisp white French cuff of the dress shirt, was ink. It wasn't a subtle mark, a shadow, or a bruise. It was a harsh, jagged tattoo, a thick tribal-style serpent, coiling around the wrist, its scales rendered in faded, cheap green and black ink. Kyle felt as if the deck of the yacht had suddenly dropped out from beneath his feet, plunging him into a freefall. His father, Jack Abbott, the epitome of Genoa City's old money elite, a man who meticulously curated every single aspect of his appearance, did not have a tattoo. He certainly did not have a cheap prison-style serpent inked into his wrist. The air in the cabin seemed to evaporate entirely. Kyle's heart slammed against his ribs with the force of a battering ram. The man sitting in the chair, wearing his father's clothes, possessing his father's silver hair and broad shoulders, was not Jack Abbott. Slowly, as if moving through deep freezing water, Diane lifted her head. She pulled her hand away from the man's arm as if she had been burned by fire, her eyes wide, her blown pupils swallowing her irises. She looked up, seeking her son in the dim light. Kyle was already looking at her. The silence that stretched between mother and son was absolute a vacuum of terror that sucked all the oxygen from the room. They didn't need to speak a single word. Diane's horrified gaze communicated the unnatural alien feel of the man's body. Kyle's wide, panicked eyes communicated the impossible visual evidence permanently inked onto the man's wrist. In that single agonizing exchange of terrified glances, the horrifying truth crystallized between them with shattering clarity. The person sitting in front of them was an imposter. Diane scrambled backward, her high heels catching in the thick carpet as she desperately crab-walked away from the armchair. She bumped hard into Kyle, who instantly threw a fierce protective arm around her shoulders, pulling her behind his larger frame. "Who are you?" Diane demanded, her voice no longer a comforting whisper but a shrill, piercing shriek of absolute terror. "Where's my husband?" The sharp, aggressive tone of her voice seemed to shatter the twisted spell in the room. The man in the chair, who had been flawlessly feigning a drugged stupor, suddenly snapped to attention. His head jerked up, and for the first time the dim light caught his face fully. It looked exactly like Jack. The strong jawline, the aristocratic nose, the familiar laugh lines around the eyes. It was a flawless, terrifying replica. But the eyes themselves were entirely wrong. They weren't Jack's warm, intelligent, piercing blue. They were dark, frantic, and filled with the cornered, desperate panic of a trapped animal. When confronted, the imposter realized the charade was instantly over. The illusion had been irrevocably breached. I didn't," the fake Jack stammered, his voice entirely wrong. It wasn't Jack's smooth, commanding baritone. It was a reedy, nasal tenor trembling violently with fear. Panic seized the imposter completely. With a sudden, explosive burst of desperate energy, he vaulted out of the armchair. He didn't go for Patty, and he didn't try to attack Kyle. He just wanted to escape the claustrophobic confines of the cabin. He lunged toward the heavy teak door, his movements clumsy and frantic, a desperate, wild bid for freedom. "Stop him!" Diane screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the fleeing figure. Kyle didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. Fueled by a potent cocktail of adrenaline, rage, and sheer terror for his real father's safety, Kyle launched himself across the cabin. He tackled the imposter just as the man reached the doorway, sending them both crashing violently into a heavy mahogany side table. A crystal lamp shattered on the floor, raining sharp shards of glass across the plush carpet. The imposter thrashed wildly, throwing elbows and kicking out in a blind feral panic. He was surprisingly strong, fueled by the desperation of a man who knew he was caught in a deadly high-stakes game. Kyle grunted as a sharp elbow caught him hard in the ribs, but he refused to let go. He grabbed the man by the lapels of the ruined suit, pinning him brutally against the paneled wall. "Where is he?" Kyle roared, his face mere inches from the terrifyingly familiar face of his father. "Where is Jack Abbott?" The imposter spit out a string of panicked curses, twisting his head violently from side to side to escape Kyle's iron grip. As he thrashed, Kyle's hand slipped from the lapel and caught the man roughly by the jaw. Kyle felt it instantly. The skin didn't feel like human skin. It was rubbery, unnaturally thick, and cold to the touch. And as the man twisted his neck in a violent arc, the flesh beneath Kyle's fingers didn't stretch, it buckled. A thick, unnatural fold appeared just below the jawline, revealing a stark, jarring contrast in skin tone beneath the edge. Kyle's eyes widened in absolute horror. What the hell? Without thinking, driven by a morbid, terrifying curiosity, Kyle dug his fingers into the unnatural fold at the man's neck. He clamped down hard and pulled upward with all his strength. The sound was sickening, a wet, tearing adhesive rip that echoed loudly over the heavy, ragged breathing of the two men. The imposter screamed, slapping his hands to his face, but it was far too late. The flawless, terrifying replica of Jack Abbott's face stretched distorted into a grotesque caricature and peeled away in one horrifying continuous motion. The latex mask tore free from the heavy spirit gum, holding it to the man's real skin snapping back like a thick rubber band. Kyle stumbled backward, his breath, leaving him in a rush, the lifeless, empty face of his father dangling limply from his trembling hand. Diane let out a blood-curdling scream, pressing her hands over her mouth as her knees finally gave out, sending her collapsing to the floor among the shattered crystal. The man pinned against the wall was gasping for air, his real face slick with sweat and the shiny, sticky residue of adhesive. He was completely unfamiliar. He had sharp, rat-like features, a receding hairline, and terrified, dark, beady eyes. He was a total stranger, a nobody, a hired ghost paid to wear the skin of a patriarch. He wasn't Jack Abbott. The gruesome revelation shattered whatever fragile reality Patty Williams was clinging to. The sight of her beloved smilin' Jack, having his face literally ripped off to reveal a sweaty, panicked stranger, was too much for her already fractured psyche to bear. Patty let out a high-pitched warbling shriek, dropping her silver hairbrush to the floor with a clatter. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, shrinking into the furthest corner of the cabin, pulling her legs tight to her chest. She began to rock back and forth, her entire body trembling violently as if she were freezing to death. "No, no, no, no," Patty chanted, slapping her hands over her ears, as if she could block out the visual nightmare unfolding in front of her. "That's not him. That's not my Jack. Where is my Jack?" Kyle, still clutching the grotesque, hollow latex mask, turned his furious, burning gaze on the cowering woman. He stepped over the shivering imposter who had slumped against the wall in absolute defeat and marched toward Patty. "You tell us, Patty," Kyle shouted, his voice echoing like thunder in the confined space of the yacht. "Where is my father? What have you done with him?" "I didn't do it," Patty sobbed, her manic delight entirely replaced by abject, trembling terror. Thick tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup and leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know at first. They brought him to me in the dark. They said it was my reward. My redemption." Diane crawled forward through the glass, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she grabbed the edge of the chaise lounge to pull herself up. Patty, who brought him to you?" Patty looked up, her eyes wild with a fear that went far beyond her usual tragic delusions. She was genuinely, deeply terrified for her life. I can't say. They'll kill me. They told me if I didn't play along, if I didn't keep him here on the boat and pretend he was the real Jack, they would lock me away in a dark box forever. They said I would never see the sun." Again... "Who?" Diane screamed, grabbing Patty by the shoulders and shaking her violently. "Who set this up?" Patty's teeth chattered, her voice dropping to a terrified, breathless whisper that barely carried over the sound of the waves outside. "I don't know his name, but he's a monster. A mysterious person in the shadows. He arranged everything. The boat, the mask, the man. He set it all up. He told me I had to keep the Abbott family distracted. He told me I had to make you believe Jack was here." Kyle and Diane exchanged another look, this one utterly devoid of the fleeting relief they had felt just minutes ago. The sheer horror of the latex mask resting in Kyle's hand was nothing compared to the chilling, paralyzing reality of Patty's confession. If this man was a mere decoy, a theatrical prop arranged by a mysterious, powerful puppet master who had the vast resources to create a flawless, Hollywood-grade disguise and manipulate a dangerously deranged woman like Patty Williams, then where was the real Jack Abbott? The cold, damp air of Lake Michigan seemed to seep directly through the hull of the yacht, freezing Diane's heart in her chest. The manhunt wasn't over. It had only just begun, and the real Jack was still out there, lost in the shadows, entirely at the mercy of a faceless monster they couldn't even begin to understand.